The wire cage sat at the bottom of the wooden bucket, 18 inches below the ice, and when Nathaniel Coldwater pulled it up 3 days later, a full-grown beaver was inside, alive and unharmed. He hadn't walked to the trap location across the frozen lake. He hadn't left a single footprint in the snow surrounding the site. Other trappers in the Montana Territory were catching one beaver every 5 days if they were lucky, and Nate was pulling 3 a week from traps that seemed to catch game by magic. What he had discovered in the winter of 1842 would revolutionize trapping across the northern Rockies, but the innovation that made him a legend didn't start with genius. It started with desperation and a frozen creek that refused to give up its secrets. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're fascinated by forgotten survival innovations from the frontier, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is about a mountain man who invented something even more unbelievable than this. The winter of 1841 had been the worst of Nathaniel Coldwater's life, and he had survived 8 winters in the mountains. He was 32 years old, lean and weathered, with a dark beard that had started showing gray at the temples. He had come west from Pennsylvania in 1833, drawn by stories of fortunes made in beaver pelts and the promise of freedom that the Rocky Mountains represented. For 8 years, he had made a decent living, not wealthy, but comfortable enough. He knew the streams and valleys of southwestern Montana better than most trappers working the territory. He understood beaver behavior, knew where to set traps for maximum success, and had developed a reputation at the trading posts for bringing in quality pelts. But the winter of 1841 changed everything. The beaver populations had been declining for years as more trappers worked the region. Competition had intensified. Areas that once yielded easy catches now required long expeditions into remote valleys. Worse, the animals were learning. Beaver that survived trap encounters became cautious, trap-wise, avoiding anything that looked or smelled wrong. Other trappers were experiencing the same difficulties, but most assumed it was just a temporary downturn. Nate recognized something more fundamental was happening. By January of 1842, his trap lines were producing half of what they had the previous year. He was running 40 traps across a territory that stretched 15 miles along various creeks and streams. In previous winters, he would check each trap every 3 days and expect to find beaver in at least 15 of them. Now he was finding beaver in 5 or 6. The mathematics were brutal. His income had dropped by more than half, while his expenses remained constant. Traps wore out and needed replacement. He still needed food, powder, lead, and supplies from the trading post. The furs he was catching barely covered his costs. Other trappers were struggling too, but Nate heard rumors that some men were still doing well. Marcus Webb, who ran the trading post at the confluence of 2 rivers 30 miles north, mentioned that a few trappers were bringing in good numbers. Not exceptional, but steady. When Nate asked what they were doing differently, Marcus just shrugged. "Trade secrets," he said. "Every man protects his methods." Nate spent long evenings in his cabin thinking about the problem. His traps were well made, his sets were good. He was using proper bait and lure. So why were the beaver avoiding them? He began paying closer attention to his trap lines, not just checking them mechanically, but observing everything around each set. And that's when he noticed something that would change everything: his tracks. Everywhere he went, he left clear evidence of his presence. Snowshoe prints leading to and from every trap location. The packed trail his repeated visits created. The disturbed snow around each set where he knelt to check and reset traps. The beaver could see all of it. Nate started paying attention to tracks in a way he never had before. His own snowshoe prints created obvious trails across the frozen landscape, visible from hundreds of yards away. Every trap location was marked by disturbance. Packed snow where he knelt, depressions where he had set his pack down, the scattered debris of his work, and his scent, carried on everything he touched, lingering in the cold air for days. He had always known that animals were cautious around human presence, but he had assumed that proper trap placement and good bait would overcome that caution. Now he realized how naive that assumption had been. The beaver weren't just cautious, they were actively avoiding any area that showed signs of human activity. His trap lines had become a map of places to stay away from. The problem extended beyond his own tracks. Other trappers were working the same general territory, and their trails crisscrossed the valleys like a web. Every trapper had his own territory, but the boundaries were informal and overlapping. A beaver moving along a creek might encounter evidence of human presence every few hundred yards. The cumulative effect was that the animals were learning to associate certain landscape features with danger. Ice holes meant traps. Disturbed snow meant humans. Fresh scent meant leave immediately. Nate spent a week in late January checking his traps and catching nothing, not a single beaver. He found evidence of animals moving through the area, fresh chews on willow branches, recently maintained dams, but nothing in his traps. He tried different baits. He tried different lure mixtures. He moved traps to new locations. Nothing worked. The beaver were simply avoiding anywhere he had been. On the evening of January 28th, he sat in his cabin studying the problem from every angle. Traditional trapping required visiting each trap location multiple times per week. That was just the nature of the work. But every visit left evidence. Every approach and departure created tracks. Every inspection disturbed the site. There was no way around it using conventional methods, unless he could trap without approaching the traps. The thought seemed impossible at first. How could you set a trap without going to the location? How could you check it without visiting the site? But Nate turned the idea over in his mind, looking for any angle that might work. What if the trap wasn't on the surface? What if it was somewhere that didn't require walking across open snow to reach it? What if there was a way to access trap locations without leaving the telltale evidence that scared away every animal within a quarter mile? He thought about ice fishing, which required cutting holes but allowed access to water without disturbing the surrounding landscape significantly. He thought about the underground passages that beaver used, tunnels beneath the ice connecting their lodges to deeper water. He thought about how animals moved in winter, using routes that humans couldn't see. Somewhere in those thoughts was an answer. He just needed to find it. The next morning, he decided to stop checking his traditional trap lines entirely. Instead, he would spend his time observing, watching, learning how the animals actually moved through the winter landscape when humans weren't interfering. Nate chose a section of creek about 2 miles from his cabin where he had seen consistent beaver activity. Instead of setting traps, he simply watched. He built a small observation post in a cluster of pine trees on a hillside overlooking the frozen waterway. From there, he could see a 100-yard stretch of ice without being visible or leaving tracks near the creek itself. He visited the post before dawn, approaching from downwind, and stayed until after dark. The first 2 days revealed nothing. The creek appeared lifeless, just a ribbon of snow-covered ice winding through the valley. But on the third morning, Nate noticed something. Near a partially collapsed beaver lodge, the snow cover on the ice was thinner in one spot. Not obviously different, just slightly less accumulated. He watched that spot for 3 hours before he saw movement. A dark shadow beneath the ice, visible only because he was looking directly at it in good light. A beaver swimming under the frozen surface. Over the next week, Nate mapped the underwater activity. The beaver weren't traveling across the surface at all. They were using passages beneath the ice, moving between their lodge and feeding areas without ever exposing themselves to the air. The lodge had underwater entrances that stayed ice-free because of the animal's body heat and regular use. From those entrances, the beaver could access the entire creek system without surfacing. Nate realized he had been thinking about trapping completely wrong. He had been trying to intercept animals on their surface routes, placing traps on land or in shallow water where beaver came ashore. But in winter, the beaver rarely used those routes. They stayed below the ice where it was safer and warmer. His traps, no matter how well placed or baited, were in locations the animals simply weren't visiting. If he wanted to catch beaver in winter, he needed to place traps where the beaver actually were, under the ice, in the underwater passages they used for travel. But how could he do that without the trap freezing solid or becoming inaccessible? Nate cut an ice hole near where he had observed the shadow movement. The ice was 14 inches thick, requiring an hour of work with his ice chisel. When he finally broke through, water welled up and he could see the current flowing beneath. He lowered a baited steel trap on a chain, trying to position it in what he guessed was the travel route. The next day, he returned to find the hole frozen over. He chopped it open again and pulled up the trap. Nothing. The trap had frozen into the slush, and even if a beaver had approached it, the metal was now encased in ice. He tried again with different methods, keeping the hole open with regular visits, but that created the same track problem he was trying to avoid. Covering the hole with bark and snow, but that froze solid and made checking impossible. Every approach had a fatal flaw. He needed a way to keep the trap accessible and functional beneath the ice while remaining able to check it without constant surface visits. The solution came to Nate from a memory he hadn't thought about in years. When he was 12 years old, growing up in eastern Pennsylvania, his father had taken him to a creek to catch minnows for fishing bait. They had used a wire basket trap, a simple device made of bent wire formed into a cylinder with a cone-shaped entrance at each end. The minnows would swim through the narrow cone opening to reach bait inside, but once in, they couldn't figure out how to escape through the same small opening. The principle was elegant. No springs, no trigger mechanism, no moving parts that could freeze or fail. Just geometry that worked in the animal's favor going in and against them coming out. Nate realized the same principle could work for beaver. A wire cage large enough to hold a full-grown animal with a funnel entrance that allowed easy entry but difficult exit. Unlike a steel trap that clamped on a leg, a cage trap would hold the animal alive and unharmed. More importantly, a wire cage wouldn't be defeated by ice the way a steel trap with springs and triggers would be. Water could flow through the wire. Ice might form on it, but wouldn't lock the mechanism because there was no mechanism to lock. He spent 3 days building his first prototype. Wire was expensive, but he had some heavy-gauge iron wire that he had been saving for trap repairs. He cut lengths and bent them into a cylindrical frame roughly 18 inches long and 8 inches in diameter. The frame formed the skeleton. Then he wove thinner wire between the frame pieces to create a mesh cage with gaps small enough that a beaver couldn't squeeze through. At one end, he formed a cone from the wire mesh, creating a funnel that extended into the cage interior. The opening at the narrow end of the cone was just wide enough for a beaver to push through, maybe 5 inches across. The design had problems in the first version. The wire was too flexible, and the whole cage collapsed when he tried to handle it. He added more frame pieces, creating a rigid structure. The cone entrance was too short, and he worried a beaver could back out easily. He extended it deeper into the cage interior. The wire mesh had gaps that were too large. He wove additional wire to close them. After a week of work, he had a cage that looked functional. It was heavy, awkward, and used up most of his wire supply, but it seemed solid. He tested it with a piece of meat inside, submerging it in the creek near his cabin where the water wasn't frozen. Within an hour, a mink had entered and couldn't escape. Nate carefully pulled up the cage with the mink inside, verified the animal was unharmed, and released it. The concept worked, but he still faced the fundamental problem of how to place this cage under the ice, keep it accessible, and check it without leaving tracks all over the landscape. The cage trap was only half of the solution. He needed something more. The wire cage alone would freeze into the ice within hours of placement, creating the same problems as steel traps. Nate needed a housing system that would protect the trap while keeping it accessible. He considered and rejected several ideas. A wooden box would work, but would be too heavy and difficult to retrieve. A canvas bag would freeze stiff. A leather pouch would be expensive and still freeze. He needed something rigid, waterproof, and easy to pull up and lower down through an ice hole. The answer was sitting in the corner of his cabin. A wooden bucket he used for hauling water. It was cylindrical, about 12 inches across and 20 inches deep, made of pine staves bound with iron hoops. Watertight and strong enough to hold weight when lifted on a rope. If he cut a hole in the ice and lowered the bucket into the water, the wire cage could sit inside the bucket, protected from the worst of the ice formation while remaining submerged in the current. Nate drilled a series of holes around the bottom third of the bucket to allow water flow while keeping the structure intact. The holes would let current pass through, carrying scent from bait and allowing the beaver to detect the trap. He attached a sturdy rope to the bucket handle, long enough to reach from below the ice to above the snow surface. The rope would be his retrieval system. The key innovation was in how he managed the ice hole. Instead of leaving it exposed to freeze solid, he cut a hole slightly larger than the bucket diameter, roughly 14 inches across. He lowered the bucket into place, letting it hang suspended in the current with the wire cage inside. Then he covered the hole with a wooden platform made of thin boards, just large enough to span the opening. On top of the platform, he piled snow, smoothing it to match the surrounding surface. The rope extended up through a small gap in the platform boards, and he marked its location with a thin willow branch pushed into the snow at an angle that looked natural. From 10 feet away, the trap site was invisible. From 20 feet, it disappeared completely into the landscape. The only way to know a trap was there was to know exactly where to look for the willow marker. No tracks led to the site because Nate had approached across the ice before snow fell, set the trap, and hadn't returned. The bucket hung in the current, the wire cage waited inside, and any beaver using that underwater passage would encounter the trap without any surface warning. 3 days later, Nate approached the site for the first time since setting the trap. He had walked in a wide circle, approaching from downstream on the ice itself rather than across the snow-covered banks. He found his willow marker, brushed away the snow from the platform, pulled it aside, and hauled up the rope. The bucket came up heavy. When it cleared the ice, he saw the wire cage inside. And inside the cage, angry and very much alive, was a beaver that weighed at least 40 pounds. The first successful catch proved the concept worked, but Nate knew he needed to refine his technique before the method would be truly reliable. He spent the next month experimenting with every variable he could control. Placement location mattered enormously. Not every section of creek had underwater beaver passages, and setting traps in random locations produced nothing. He learned to read the ice and snow for subtle signs of animal activity below. Thin spots in the snow cover indicated warmer water underneath, usually caused by regular beaver traffic. Small air holes that never completely froze marked active lodge entrances. Patterns in the surface snow sometimes revealed the contours of beaver paths worn into the creek bottom beneath the ice. Depth was critical. The bucket needed to hang in the current where beaver naturally traveled, usually 2 to 4 feet below the ice. Too shallow, and the trap would freeze into the ice despite the bucket protection. Too deep, and beaver would swim over or around it. Nate learned to measure depth carefully before cutting his ice holes, using a weighted line to map the creek bottom and identify the travel lanes. Bait placement inside the wire cage required thought. Fresh willow branches were the most reliable attractant, positioned at the back of the cage so beaver had to fully enter to reach them. He tried various configurations before settling on a bundle of 3 or 4 willow tips, still green and fresh, wedged into the back of the wire mesh. The scent carried through the water flow, creating a scent trail that drew beaver from upstream. The silent aspect of the trap became one of its greatest advantages. Traditional steel traps snapped closed with a metallic crack that echoed across frozen valleys. That sound alerted every animal within earshot that danger was present. The wire cage made no sound. A beaver entered, realized it couldn't exit, and simply waited. No panic thrashing, no distress calls, nothing to warn other animals away from the area. Nate could run multiple traps in the same creek section without each catch alerting and educating the remaining beaver population. He developed a checking routine that minimized his visible presence. Instead of visiting each trap every 3 days on a predictable schedule, he varied his timing and approach routes. Sometimes he came across the ice. Sometimes he approached from upstream or downstream along the creek bank, stepping on rocks and logs to avoid leaving tracks in snow. He checked some traps frequently and others only once a week, learning which locations produced consistent catches and which were marginal. By early March, Nate was running 12 bucket traps across 4 different creek sections. His catch rate had climbed to 3 beaver per week, sometimes 4. That was triple what he had been catching with conventional methods during the same period the previous year. More importantly, the beaver population in his territory wasn't declining. Because his traps were invisible and silent, the animals weren't being educated about trap danger. They simply disappeared occasionally, taken by a system they never learned to recognize or avoid. By late March of 1842, other trappers began noticing that Nathaniel Coldwater was having a remarkable season. At the trading post, Marcus Webb kept informal tallies of what each trapper brought in, and Nate's numbers stood out dramatically. Most trappers were bringing in 8 to 12 beaver pelts per month. Few skilled trappers managed 15. Nate was bringing in 20 to 25, and the pelts were prime quality because the animals were uninjured and had been retrieved quickly. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. At the trading post, conversations would stop when Nate arrived with another load of furs. Men would watch him unload, counting pelts, trying to read something in his expression or behavior that would explain his success. Some assumed he had found a secret valley where beaver were still abundant. Others thought he had made an arrangement with local native tribes who were showing him productive areas in exchange for trade goods. A few muttered about witchcraft or dark bargains, though mostly as jokes. Marcus Webb finally asked directly. They were alone in the trading post on a cold afternoon in early April. Marcus was examining Nate's latest batch of pelts, noting their quality in his ledger. "You're having a hell of a season, Nate," he said, keeping his tone casual. "What's your secret? Better traps? New territory?" Nate had been expecting the question. He gave the vague answer that trappers typically gave. "Just paying attention," he said. "Watching where the beaver actually go, instead of where I think they should be." Marcus nodded, accepting the non-answer. Every trapper protected his methods. It was understood. But the question circulated. Other trappers approached Nate with varying degrees of directness. Some asked if he would share territory or partner up for the next season. Others tried to follow him when he left the trading post, hoping to discover his trap locations. Nate was careful about his movements, varying his routes and timing to avoid leading anyone to his sights. The rumors grew more elaborate. Dutch Keller, a gruff trapper who had been working the mountains for 15 years, claimed Nate had discovered a hidden valley where beaver had never been trapped before. Thomas Grayson, a younger man in his second season, suggested Nate was running traps at night when other trappers were sleeping. William Crane, who trapped the territory north of Nate's area, insisted that Coldwater must be using poison bait, though that made no sense since poison beaver would be worthless for fur. Nate let the rumors circulate without correction. Misdirection was useful. As long as other trappers were inventing elaborate explanations, they wouldn't stumble on the simple truth. He was trapping under the ice using methods they hadn't imagined. His advantage wasn't secret locations or special agreements. It was engineering and observation. But that advantage would disappear immediately if others learned the technique. So Nate kept quiet, collected his pelts, and watched his income climb to levels he had never experienced in 8 years of mountain trapping. Thomas Grayson showed up at Nate's cabin on a cold morning in mid-April. He was 24 years old, thin, and looked exhausted. This was his second season trapping, and it was clear the winter had beaten him down. He sat on the log bench outside Nate's door and spoke plainly. "I caught 11 beaver all season," he said. "I owe Marcus Webb for supplies, and I don't have enough pelts to cover the debt. I'll be heading back east unless something changes." He paused, then added, "I'm not asking you to give me anything, but if you're willing to teach me what you're doing, I'll split my catch with you next season, 50-50. Nate studied the young man. Thomas wasn't lazy or incompetent. He had worked hard, just like everyone else. He was failing because the old methods didn't work anymore in overhunted territory. That wasn't his fault. Nate made a decision that surprised himself. "Keep your catch," he said. "I'll show you what I'm doing, but you have to swear you won't teach anyone else without asking me first." Thomas agreed immediately. They walked to the nearest trap site that afternoon. Nate explained everything as they went, the invisible markers, the approach routes that avoided leaving tracks, the ice hole concealment system. When he pulled up the bucket and Thomas saw the wire cage with a beaver inside, the young man's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to excitement in the span of seconds. "You're trapping underwater," Thomas said. "That's why there's no tracks. That's why nobody can figure it out." Nate spent 3 days teaching Thomas the complete system: how to read ice and snow for beaver activity below, how to identify underwater travel routes, how to build the wire cage with the proper cone entrance, how to construct the bucket housing and position it correctly, how to place bait that would create scent trails in the current, how to check traps without leaving evidence, how to vary timing and approach routes. Thomas built his first bucket trap under Nate's supervision, working carefully to match the design. They set it together in a creek section 3 miles from Nate's territory. 5 days later, they checked it and found a beaver inside. Thomas stared at the cage for a long moment, then started laughing. "All winter I was setting traps where I could see them," he said. "The beaver were underneath the whole time, and I never knew." Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas set up 4 more bucket traps in his territory. His catch rate immediately improved. By early May, when the spring thaw would end the season, Thomas had added 14 more beaver to his winter total. Not enough to make him wealthy, but enough to pay his debt to Marcus and have money left for next season's supplies. More importantly, he had learned a method that would serve him for years. Word that Thomas Grayson's luck had suddenly changed spread quickly through the trapping community. Thomas Grayson kept his promise about not sharing the technique without permission, but his sudden success raised questions he couldn't easily deflect. By the summer of 1842, other trappers knew something had changed. The pattern was obvious. Thomas had struggled all winter, then suddenly started catching beaver at a rate comparable to Nate's. Whatever Coldwater had taught him, it worked. That fall, 2 more trappers approached Nate directly: William Crane and a man named Jacob Hastings, who had recently arrived from the east. They didn't ask for charity or offer partnership. They simply pointed out that the technique would spread eventually, and they would rather learn it properly than try to puzzle it out through observation and guesswork. Nate agreed on one condition: they had to share the method only with trappers who asked directly and who agreed to the same terms. No public demonstrations, no teaching without permission. Keep the knowledge within a community of people who understood its value. By the winter of 1843, 8 trappers in the Montana Territory were using variations of the bucket trap system. Each man adapted the design based on his materials and territory. Some used smaller cages for muskrat and mink. Others built larger versions for beaver. A few experimented with different bucket designs, using bark containers or woven willow baskets instead of wooden buckets. The core principle remained constant: underwater placement, concealed access, silent operation, minimal surface disturbance. The technique spread organically over the following years, carried by trappers who moved between territories and by word of mouth at trading posts and rendezvous gatherings. No one wrote it down. There were no diagrams or instruction manuals. The knowledge transferred through demonstration and apprenticeship the same way most frontier skills spread. By the late 1840s, trappers across the northern Rockies were using some version of what had started being called the Coldwater method, or simply silent traps. The method proved especially valuable as beaver populations continued declining. In territories that had been trapped heavily using conventional methods, beaver had become so wary that traditional traps caught almost nothing. But silent traps continued producing because the animals never learned to recognize them as threats. The technique extended the viability of trapping in areas that would have otherwise been abandoned as played out. Adaptations expanded beyond beaver. Trappers discovered that similar principles worked for other aquatic animals. Muskrat could be trapped using smaller wire cages in shallow marshes. Mink responded to bucket traps placed along creek banks where their underwater hunting routes passed. Otter, though rare and difficult to catch, occasionally entered larger cages set in deeper water. Some trappers even adapted the concept for fish, using the cone entrance design to create traps that caught multiple fish in a single set. The technique's influence lasted well beyond the fur trade era. When beaver trapping declined in the 1850s due to changing fashion and depleted populations, the methods Nate had developed influenced how frontier settlers managed wildlife. Hunters and trappers through the 1860s and 70s continued using variations of underwater cage traps for both subsistence and commercial purposes. Nathaniel Coldwater continued trapping through the winter of 1853, 20 years after he first came to the mountains. He was 54 years old by then, his beard fully gray, his hands scarred from decades of cold water work and sharp wire. The fur trade had long since collapsed as beaver felt went out of fashion, replaced by silk in hat manufacturing. But there was still a market for quality pelts, smaller than before, serving specialty buyers who paid premium prices for exceptional furs. Nate had saved money during his best years and invested it carefully. He owned his cabin outright and had enough supplies to last several seasons without a single sale. He trapped not because he needed the money, but because he genuinely loved the work. The solitude The observation, the quiet satisfaction of building something that worked perfectly. His bucket traps, refined over 2 decades, were masterpieces of simple engineering. Wire cages that lasted for years, wooden buckets carefully maintained, rope systems that never failed. In 1854, Nate made a decision that surprised the few trappers who still knew him. He started guiding settlers through the Montana Territory, using his knowledge of the land to help wagon trains find safe routes and good locations for homesteads. The West was changing rapidly. Where there had been only trappers and native tribes, there were now families seeking farmland and merchants establishing towns. Nate recognized that his era was ending, and rather than resist the change, he adapted to it. He guided settlers for 7 years, leading 12 wagon trains successfully through the mountains without losing a single family to accident or conflict. He earned a reputation for caution and competence, and families specifically requested him as their guide. In 1861, at age 62, he retired from guiding and settled permanently in his mountain cabin. He lived simply, hunting and fishing for food, occasionally trapping for his own amusement, and spending long, quiet days in the wilderness he had called home for nearly 40 years. The silent trap method he had pioneered continued spreading long after most people forgot who had invented it. Modern wildlife management programs in the 20th century developed humane trapping techniques that used principles nearly identical to what Nate had discovered in 1842. Live cage traps with funnel entrances became standard tools for biologists studying animal populations. The basic geometry that Nate had adapted from childhood memories of minnow traps became foundational to ethical wildlife capture across North America. Nathaniel Coldwater died in his cabin in January of 1872. He was 73 years old. A trapper checking on him found him in his bed, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. He was buried in a small cemetery near the trading post where Marcus Webb had once kept tallies of pelts. His grave marker was simple wood, noting only his name and years. Within a generation, even that marker had weathered away to nothing. But in creeks and streams across the northern Rockies, the principles he had discovered remained. Silent, invisible, effective. The impossible made routine through observation, engineering, and the quiet determination of one man who refused to accept that the old ways were the only ways.